the haunting of Hollow Creek Bridge. In the quiet rural stretch of northern Georgia, there's an old rickety bridge known as Hollow Creek Bridge. Built over a century ago, the bridge once served as a crucial link between the small, isolated towns scattered throughout the dense woods of the region. Now, it is little more than a relic, seldom used and frequently avoided by locals and travelers alike. The wooden planks creak with age, and the iron railings are rusted and brittle, covered in thick vines that give the bridge an almost sinister appearance. The structure spans a deep gorge, where Hollow Creek flows far below, its waters dark and cold, hidden beneath a canopy of thick, gnarled trees. To the uninitiated, Hollow Creek Bridge might seem like just another old forgotten part of rural America. But to those who have lived in the area, and especially to the truckers who navigate these remote roads, the bridge is infamous, not for its dilapidated state, but for the terrifying legend that surrounds it. Jack Turner was one of those truckers, a seasoned road warrior with over 30 years of experience behind the wheel. He had hauled goods across the entire country, from the bustling highways of the East Coast to the lonely desert roads of the Southwest. Jack had seen it all, or so he thought. He had heard his fair share of strange stories from fellow truckers, tales of ghostly apparitions, inexplicable noises, and mysterious breakdowns. But Jack was a no-nonsense kind of guy. He prided himself on his level-headedness, his ability to get the job done without letting superstitions or tall tales get in the way. To him, Hollow Creek Bridge was just another bridge, no different from the hundreds of others he had crossed in his career. That is, until one fateful night when Jack's skepticism would be put to the ultimate test. It was late autumn, and the air had grown cold and crisp. The leaves, once vibrant with shades of red, orange and yellow, had begun to fall, leaving the trees bare and skeletal. Jack was on a tight schedule, hauling a load of fresh produce from the farms of southern Georgia to a distribution center up north. The journey would take him through the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, a route he had driven countless times before. The roads in this part of the country were narrow and winding, often cutting through dense forests and deep valleys. They could be treacherous in bad weather, but Jack was confident in his abilities. He had tackled worse roads in worse conditions. As he drove, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, streaked with the last remnants of daylight. Jack flicked on his headlights as the darkness closed in, the beam cutting through the gloom. He was in good spirits, humming along to the country music, playing softly on the radio. The highway was deserted, with not another vehicle in sight, just the way Jack liked it. It was going to be an easy night, or so he thought. As the miles rolled by, Jack's route took him deeper into the wilderness. The trees grew thicker, their branches reaching out over the road like skeletal fingers. The air grew cooler, a biting wind whipping through the gaps in the trees. Jack noticed that the further he drove, the more isolated the road became. The small towns he had passed earlier were now miles behind him, and the occasional farmhouse had given way to vast stretches of untamed forest. He was completely alone, save for the rhythmic hum of the engine and the steady thrum of the tires on the asphalt. It was around midnight when Jack approached Hollow Creek Bridge. The road had been gradually descending for several miles, winding its way down into a deep valley. As he rounded a sharp bend, the bridge came into view, a dark silhouette against the night sky. The old structure looked even more ominous in the darkness, its iron railings casting long, twisted shadows across the road. The fog began to roll in, thick and heavy, creeping over the road like a living thing. The fog was unusual, denser than any Jack had seen before, swirling in patterns that seemed almost unnatural. Visibility dropped to just a few feet, and Jack instinctively slowed down, his eyes straining to see through the haze. As he approached the bridge, the fog grew thicker, enveloping the truck in a blanket of white. The headlights barely pierced the fog, making the bridge appear like a ghostly silhouette looming ahead. The old wooden planks groaned under the weight of the truck as Jack drove onto the bridge, the sound echoing through the stillness of the night. It was then that something strange happened. The truck's engine sputtered, the lights flickered, and the radio, which had been playing an old country tune, filled with static. Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the truck began to slow to a crawl. He pumped the gas pedal, but the engine refused to respond. The truck was losing power, and Jack's heart began to race as the vehicle came to a complete stop in the middle of the bridge. "What the hell?" Jack muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with frustration and a growing sense of unease. He turned the key in the ignition, but the engine wouldn't turn over. He tried again, but it was no use. The truck was dead. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of the creek flowing far below, and the occasional creak of the bridge. The usual hum of the engine and the crackle of the radio were gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made Jack's skin crawl. The fog wrapped around the truck like a shroud, and Jack suddenly felt very alone. He glanced at the dashboard, but everything seemed normal, except the truck wouldn't start. As he sat there, trying to figure out his next move, Jack heard it, a faint sound coming from outside the truck. At first he thought it was just the wind, but as he listened closer, he realized it was something else. A soft, mournful wail, like a distant cry carried on the breeze. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward, peering into the fog, but he couldn't see anything beyond the swirling white mist. The sound grew louder, a keening wail that seemed to echo from all around. It was the sound of pure despair, and it sent a chill down his spine. His hand instinctively reached for the CB radio, but all he got was static. The wail continued, rising and falling like the cry of someone in agony. Jack's pulse quickened, a sense of dread creeping over him. He knew the stories, the rumors of ghostly voices and strange apparitions on the bridge, but he had never believed them until now. Suddenly the temperature inside the cab plummeted, and Jack's breath fogged up in the cold air. The windows began to frost over, the cold seeping into his bones. Jack's hands trembled as he wiped at the frost, trying to see outside. The fog had thickened, swirling like a living thing around the truck, and the wail had turned into a chorus of the voices, each one more desperate and anguished than the last. Jack's instinct screamed at him to leave, to get off the bridge, but the truck was dead, and there was nowhere to go. He reached for the door handle, intending to step outside and check the engine, but something stopped him. A presence, a feeling of being watched. He looked into the side mirror, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There, standing in the fog just a few feet from the truck, was a figure. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair hanging in wet, matted strands over her face. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in the light, and her mouth was open in a silent scream. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the apparition, unable to move. The woman slowly raised her hand, pointing directly at him, her eyes locking onto his. Jack felt a wave of terror wash over him as the woman began to move closer, her feet barely touching the ground as she glided through the fog. He tried to start the truck again, desperately turning the key, but the engine remained silent. The woman was getting closer, her outstretched hand now just inches from the door. Jack could feel her cold presence, the air around him thick with dread. Just as she reached the window, the truck roared to life on its own, the engine revving loudly. The lights flickered back on, illuminating the figure for a brief moment before she vanished into the fog. Jack didn't hesitate. He floored the accelerator, the truck lurching forward and speeding off the bridge. He didn't stop until he was miles away, the fog finally thinning and the night sky reappearing above him. His hands were still shaking as he pulled over at the first gas station he found. He sat there for a long time, trying to calm his racing heart, but the image of the ghostly woman wouldn't leave his mind. The gas station was a small, run-down affair, the kind that was more common in rural areas. The lights were dim, and the smell of stale coffee and old oil permeated the air. Jack stumbled out of his truck, his legs shaky and unsteady, and made his way inside. The lone attendant behind the counter gave him a curious glance, but said nothing as Jack poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands still trembling. He sat down at a table in the corner, the cup of coffee in front of him untouched. His mind was racing, replaying the events on the bridge over and over again. He had heard stories from other truckers about Hollow Creek Bridge, tales of ghostly apparitions, strange occurrences, and vehicles that broke down mysteriously. He had always dismissed them as just that, stories. But now, he wasn't so sure. As he sat there, lost in thought, the door to the gas station opened and a group of truckers walked in, their voices loud and boisterous. They were a rough-looking bunch, dressed in worn flannel shirts and jeans, their faces weathered from years on the road. Jack recognized a few of them, guys he had seen at various truck stops over the years. They were all seasoned drivers, with decades of experience between them. One of the truckers, a burly man with a thick beard and a weathered cap, noticed Jack sitting alone and approached him. "Hey there, Jack," the man said, his voice gruff but friendly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jack looked up, his face pale and drawn. "Maybe I have," he muttered, more to himself than to the trucker. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What happened?" Jack hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should tell the story. But the events of the night were too fresh, too vivid in his mind to keep to himself. He took a deep breath and began to recount what had happened on Hollow Creek Bridge. As Jack spoke, the other truckers gathered around, listening intently. Their expressions ranged from curious to concerned, and by the time Jack finished, the mood in the gas station had shifted from jovial to somber. The bearded trucker, whose name was Bill, nodded slowly. "You're not the first to have an experience like that on Hollow Creek Bridge," he said, "and you probably won't be the last." Another trucker, a tall, lanky man with a weathered face, chimed in. "I've heard stories about that bridge for years. Some say it's haunted by the ghost of a woman who drowned in the creek below. Others say it's cursed, that anyone who crosses it at the wrong time is doomed." Jack frowned. "Doomed." The lanky trucker nodded. "Yeah, there have been accidents on that bridge, strange ones. Drivers who've gone missing, trucks that have broken down for no reason, just like yours. And some folks say they've seen the ghost of that woman, just like you did. Bill leaned in closer, his expression serious. There's a reason most of us avoid that bridge, Jack. It's bad luck. Some say the woman's ghost is looking for something or someone, and if she points at you, well, let's just say it's best not to stick around to find out. A heavy silence fell over the group as the weight of Bill's words sank in. Jack's mind raced, the image of the ghostly woman still fresh in his memory. The thought of her pointing at him, of the cold, hollow look in her eyes, sent a shiver down his spine. One of the younger truckers, a man in his early 30s with a scruffy beard and a nervous demeanor, spoke up. "So what do we do if we have to cross that bridge? I've got a delivery to make tomorrow, and that route takes me right over it." Bill exchanged a glance with the others before replying. "If you absolutely have to cross it, do it during the day. And if you see fog rolling in, turn around and find another route, no matter how much time it adds to your trip. Whatever you do, don't stop on that bridge. Keep moving and don't look back." The younger trucker nodded, his face pale. "Thanks for the advice, Bill." As the conversation continued, Jack's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him off that bridge, that the ghostly presence he had encountered wasn't done with him yet. He finished his coffee, the warm liquid doing little to calm his nerves, and stood up to leave. Bill gave him a sympathetic look. "Take care of yourself, Jack. And remember what I said. Stay off that bridge if you can." Jack nodded, his thoughts still swirling as he made his way back to his truck. The night was still dark, the fog having dissipated, but the chill in the air remained. As he climbed into the cab, he couldn't help but glance at the bridge in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ghostly woman standing there, watching him. The drive to his destination was uneventful, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow on the side of the road, every rustle of leaves in the trees made him jumpy. By the time he reached the distribution center, he was exhausted, both physically and mentally. He completed his delivery and parked his truck, eager to get some rest. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Jack's dreams were filled with images of Hollow Creek Bridge, of the ghostly woman and her hollow eyes. He awoke several times, drenched in sweat. The memory of her pointing finger burned into his mind. By morning, Jack was a wreck, the events of the previous night weighing heavily on him. Over the next few weeks, Jack avoided any route that took him near Hollow Creek Bridge. He took the long way around, even if it meant adding hours to his trips. The other truckers understood. They had all heard the story by now, and most of them had their own reasons for avoiding that cursed bridge. But despite his best efforts, Jack couldn't escape the memories of that night. He found himself growing increasingly paranoid, his nerves frayed by the constant sense of being watched. He began to see things out of the corner of his eye, shadows that didn't belong, fleeting glimpses of something moving just beyond his line of sight. At night, he would hear the faint wail of the ghostly voices, even when he was miles away from the bridge. One night, several weeks after his encounter, Jack was driving through a remote part of the state, the road dark and empty. He was tired, the fatigue of the past few sleepless nights catching up to him. But he pushed on, eager to complete his delivery and get some rest. As he drove, the fog began to roll in again, thick and heavy, just like that night on Hollow Creek Bridge. Jack's heart raced as the memories came flooding back, but he forced himself to stay calm. He was far from the bridge. There was no reason to panic. But then out of the fog he saw it. The figure of the ghostly woman standing in the middle of the road, her white gown billowing in the mist. Her hollow eyes locked onto his, and she slowly raised her hand, pointing directly at him. Jack's blood ran cold. He slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt just inches from the apparition. The woman didn't move, her gaze never leaving his. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. This wasn't Hollow Creek Bridge. It wasn't even close. Yet here she was, standing in front of him, as real as the night he had first seen her. The radio crackled to life, filling the cab with static. The temperature plummeted, frost forming on the windows as the cold seeped into the truck. Jack's breath came in short, panicked gasps as the woman began to move closer, her feet barely touching the ground. Desperation took hold. Jack threw the truck into reverse, the engine roaring as he backed away from the apparition. The fog swirled around him, the ghostly voices rising in a chorus of despair. But no matter how far he backed up, the woman remained in front of him, her dark eyes staring into his soul. Jack's mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was no escape. The woman was relentless, her presence growing stronger with each passing moment. The truck's engine sputtered, the lights flickered, and Jack knew he was running out of time. With a final, desperate effort, Jack slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator. The tires screeched as the truck surged forward, straight towards the apparition. But just as he was about to hit her, the woman vanished, disappearing into the fog. The truck barreled down the road, Jack's knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The fog began to thin, the ghostly voices fading into the night. But the cold, the fear, remained. When Jack finally reached the safety of the next town, he was a shell of the man he had been. The encounter had broken him, leaving him haunted by the spectre of the woman on Hollow Creek Bridge. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting for him, watching him. Jack never drove that route again. In fact, he never drove at all. He sold his truck, moved to a small town far from the haunted roads of Georgia, and tried to put the past behind him. But the memory of that night on Hollow Creek Bridge, and the woman who had followed him, would never leave him. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see her standing in the fog, her hollow eyes locking onto his, her hand slowly raising to point at him. And every time, Jack would wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of her wail still ringing in his ears. The haunting of Hollow Creek Bridge was no longer just a story to him. It was a nightmare he would live with for the rest of his days.
In the trucking industry, highways are home, and the open road is a friend, but sometimes that friend can turn on you. This story is about Rick, a seasoned trucker with over 20 years of experience, who encountered something on a lonely stretch of road that still haunts him to this day. Rick was hauling a load of timber through the dense forests of Oregon. The road he was on, Highway 20, was notorious for its sharp bends and thick fog, especially during the colder months. It was late fall, and the fog was particularly heavy that night. The kind of fog that seems to swallow everything around you, leaving you with only a few feet of visibility. As he maneuvered his rig through the winding roads, Rick felt an uneasiness that he couldn't shake. The fog was so dense that it was hard to tell if he was still on the road or veering off into the woods. But Rick was used to this. He'd driven through worse. He turned up the radio, hoping to drown out the eerie silence of the night, but even that didn't help. That's when he saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was a hitchhiker, a lone soul caught in the middle of nowhere. But as he got closer, he realized there was something wrong with the person. The figure was too still, almost like a statue. Rick slowed down, his instincts telling him to keep going, but his curiosity got the better of him. He decided to pull over and check on the person, maybe offer some help. As he approached, the figure slowly turned to face him. Rick's blood ran cold. The person's face was pale, with hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to stare right through him. Their clothes were tattered, hanging off their body as if they'd been wandering the forest for years. But what really terrified Rick was the smile, an unnatural wide grin that stretched from ear to ear, showing teeth that were too sharp to be human. Rick jumped back, scrambling to get back into his truck. He could feel the figure's eyes boring into his back as he fumbled with the door. Once inside, he floored the accelerator, not daring to look back. The fog seemed to thicken, as if trying to trap him on that cursed road. Rick's hands were shaking on the steering wheel, but he kept driving, his heart pounding in his chest. After what felt like hours, the fog finally began to lift, revealing the familiar sights of civilization. Rick didn't stop until he reached a truck stop miles away where he stumbled out of his cab, visibly shaken. He tried to explain what he saw to the other truckers, but they just laughed it off, saying he'd probably just seen a shadow or an animal. But Rick knew what he saw wasn't human. He quit trucking a few months later, unable to shake the memory of that night. Highway 20 was never the same for him. Every time he drove past that stretch of road, he could still see the figure standing there, waiting for the next unlucky soul to stop. The life of a trucker is often one of solitude, long hours on the road, and the constant search for a place to rest. For Tom, a long-haul driver who had been on the road for nearly a decade, the eerie events at Rest Stop 13 would become a nightmarish memory he could never forget. Tom had been driving non-stop for hours, his eyes growing heavy as the sun dipped below the horizon. He was somewhere in the middle of the Nevada desert, where the roads stretched out like endless ribbons of asphalt under the starry sky. He knew he needed to rest, but the next decent truck stop was still hours away. That's when he saw the sign for Rest Stop 13, an old, worn-out sign that looked like it had been there for decades. He debated whether to stop. The place looked abandoned, with only a few dim lights flickering in the distance. But exhaustion won over, and he decided to pull in. The Rest Stop was nothing more than a few crumbling buildings and a handful of parking spots, but it would have to do. Tom parked his rig and stepped out, the air eerily still around him. There was no sound, no wind, no animals, just an oppressive silence that made him uneasy. He walked over to the restroom building, its paint peeling and windows covered in grime. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, and the smell of mold and decay hit him instantly. Inside, the flickering fluorescent light cast eerie shadows on the cracked tiles and broken mirrors. Tom quickly used the facilities, eager to get back to his truck and lock the doors. But as he was washing his hands, he noticed something strange in the mirror. A shadowy figure standing behind him, just out of focus. He spun around, but there was no one there. His heart raced as he turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. He tried to brush it off as fatigue playing tricks on his mind, but the unease gnawed at him. He hurried out of the building, back into the silent night. As he approached his truck, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, a flash of something darting between the buildings. Tom stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He scanned the area but saw nothing, just shadows dancing in the dim light. He quickly climbed into his truck, locking the doors behind him. He felt a little safer inside the cab, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. He decided to leave the Rest Stop and drive a little further, but as he turned the key in the ignition, the truck wouldn't start. Frustration turned to panic as he tried again and again, but the engine remained silent. Tom's mind raced. He thought about getting out and checking the engine, but something told him to stay inside. He turned off the lights and sat in the darkness, hoping whatever was out there would lose interest. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The silence was suffocating. Then, without warning, something slammed against the side of his truck. The whole rig shook, and Tom's heart nearly jumped out of his chest. He fumbled for his flashlight, shining it out the window, but saw nothing. Another loud bang echoed through the night, this time on the other side of the truck. Tom's hands were shaking as he reached for the CB radio, but the static was the only response. He was alone with whatever was out there. Suddenly, the truck's engine roared to life on its own. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the rest stop. Tom didn't wait to question it. He put the truck in gear and tore out of the parking lot, his eyes glued to the rear-view mirror. As he sped down the highway, he could see something in the distance. Figures standing in the middle of the road at the rest stop entrance, watching him leave. They were tall, shadowy, and featureless, like silhouettes cut out of the night itself. Tom didn't stop until he reached the next town, where he found another truck stop bustling with life. He parked and sat there for a long time, trying to calm his nerves. He asked around about Rest Stop 13, but no one seemed to know anything about it. Some of the older truckers said it had been shut down years ago after a series of unexplained deaths, but the details were hazy. Tom never went back to that part of Nevada, and he always made sure to plan his routes carefully to avoid any deserted rest stops. The memory of those shadowy figures still haunted him, a reminder that the open road holds more than just the promise of freedom. It also hides the unknown, waiting in the dark. In the trucking community, there are legends passed down from one driver to the next, stories of strange occurrences on the road, sightings of ghostly apparitions, and inexplicable events that defy logic. One such story that circulates among truckers is that of the ghostly convoy, a chilling tale that has been shared in hushed tones at countless truck stops across the country. Jake was a young trucker, new to the life of long hauls and sleepless nights. He had heard the stories from older drivers, but he never took them seriously. Ghosts, haunted highways, those were just tales to scare rookies. But one night, Jake's skepticism would be put to the ultimate test. It was a cold winter night, and Jake was driving through the vast, empty plains of Kansas. The snow had begun to fall heavily, covering the road in a thick white blanket. Visibility was low and the wind howled through the desolate landscape. Jake was miles from the nearest town, with only the dim glow of his headlights cutting through the storm. As he drove, he noticed something strange in his mirrors. Headlights, far behind him, barely visible through the snow. At first, he thought it was another trucker trying to catch up, but something about the lights didn't seem right. They were too dim, too erratic, flickering in and out of existence. Jake kept an eye on the lights as he drove, but they didn't seem to get any closer. They stayed at the same distance, hovering on the edge of visibility like a phantom. The road was straight, with no turn-offs or intersections, so there was no way the other vehicle could have gone anywhere. As the hours passed, the lights remained, never drawing closer but never fading away completely. Jake tried to focus on the road ahead, but the unsettling feeling of being followed gnawed at him. He decided to speed up, hoping to lose whoever, or whatever, was behind him. But no matter how fast he drove, the lights stayed with him, a constant presence in the blizzard. Jake's nerves were on edge. He turned up the radio, trying to drown out the fear that was creeping into his mind, but even that didn't help. The storm was getting worse and the road was becoming harder to navigate. Suddenly, out of the swirling snow, Jake saw something ahead. More headlights coming towards him. He slowed down, squinting through the windshield to see what was ahead. A convoy of trucks was approaching, but something was off. The trucks were moving slowly, almost as if they were gliding over the road. As the convoy passed by, Jake got a closer look. The trucks were old, with faded paint and rusted exteriors, like relics from another era. Their drivers were barely visible through the snow-covered windshields, but Jake could see their faces, pale, expressionless, and ghostly. They didn't acknowledge him as they passed, their eyes staring straight ahead as if he wasn't even there. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the convoy disappeared into the storm behind him. He checked his mirrors again, but the lights that had been following him were gone. He was alone on the road once more, but the eerie feeling of being watched remained. He drove on in silence, his mind racing with thoughts of what he had just seen. He had heard stories of ghostly convoys before, but he never believed them, until now. The thought that he had encountered something supernatural sent chills down his spine. As dawn broke, the storm began to subside, and Jake finally reached his destination. He pulled into a truck stop, desperate for answers. He asked the other drivers if they had seen anything unusual on the road that night, but they all shook their heads. One old-timer, however, pulled Jake aside and told him a story. Years ago, a convoy of trucks had gone missing in a blizzard on that same stretch of road. The drivers were never found, and the trucks were presumed lost. Some say their spirits still haunt the highway, eternally trapped in a ghostly convoy, searching for a way home. Jake never drove that route again. The memory of those ghostly trucks stayed with him, a reminder that some legends are more than just stories. They're warnings, passed down by those who have seen the things that lurk in the shadows of the open road. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, there's a stretch of road known to truckers as Dead Man's Curve. The sharp bend in the road has been the site of countless accidents, many of them fatal. Some say the road is cursed, others believe it's just a dangerous spot, but for one trucker, Dead Man's Curve became the scene of a nightmare he would never forget. Mike was an experienced trucker with over 30 years on the road. He had driven through all kinds of terrain, in all kinds of weather, but nothing could have prepared him for what he encountered on that fateful night. It was a clear, moonlit night as Mike navigated his rig through the winding roads of the Appalachians. He was hauling a load of machinery to a factory on the other side of the mountains, a route he had taken many times before. As he approached Dead Man's Curve, he slowed down, knowing how treacherous the bend could be. As he rounded the curve, something strange happened. The temperature inside the cab suddenly dropped, his breath fogging up in the cold air. Mike glanced at the dashboard, but everything seemed normal. He chalked it up to the mountain air and focused on the road. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move in the trees alongside the road. A shadow, large and fast, darting between the trees. Mike's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he scanned the darkness, but he couldn't see anything. Then, without warning, something hit the side of his truck with a force that nearly knocked him off the road. Mike fought to keep the rig under control as it swerved dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to regain control. He pulled the truck to a stop, his hands shaking as he reached for his flashlight. He got out of the cab, the cold air biting at his skin, and walked around to inspect the damage. There was a massive dent in the side of the truck, but what caused it was nowhere to be seen. Mike shone the flashlight into the woods, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. He was about to get back into the truck when he heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the forest. Mike froze, the sound sending chills down his spine. It wasn't the sound of any animal he'd ever heard before. It was deep, menacing, and filled with malice. He slowly backed up towards the truck, his eyes never leaving the tree line. Just as he reached the door, something massive and black lunged out of the woods, slamming into the side of the truck with terrifying speed. Mike barely managed to get inside and slam the door. Just as he reached the door, something massive and black lunged out of the woods, slamming into the side of the truck with terrifying speed. Mike barely managed to get inside and slam the door shut before the creature was on him. The truck shook violently as the creature attacked, its growls and snarls filling the night. Mike could see it now through the window, an enormous shadowy figure with glowing red eyes, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Mike threw the truck into gear and floored the accelerator. The tires screeched as the rig lurched forward, but the creature was relentless, chasing after him with unnatural speed. It slammed into the back of the truck, nearly sending it off the road again. Mike pushed the truck to its limits, the engine roaring as he sped down the mountain road. The creature was right behind him, its red eyes glowing in the rearview mirror. Mike could feel its presence, a dark, malevolent force that seemed to seep into the very air around him. Just when he thought he couldn't outrun it, the creature let out a bone-chilling roar and disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. The truck lurched forward, as if released from some invisible grip, and Mike found himself driving down an empty road once more. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of the next town. When he inspected the truck, the massive dent was still there, along with deep gouges in the metal that looked like claw marks. Mike knew what he had encountered wasn't of this world. He had heard stories of demons and spirits that haunted the mountains, but he never believed them. Until that night. He never drove Dead Man's Curve again, and every time he told the story, he could see the doubt in people's eyes. But Mike knew what he saw, what he felt, and he knew that there were things out there on the road, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the next unlucky soul to cross their path. The legend of the vanishing hitchhiker is one of the oldest and most enduring urban legends, but for one trucker, it became a terrifying reality. This is the story of Sam, a trucker who picked up a hitchhiker on a stormy night, only to have the encounter turn into something far more sinister. Sam was driving through the back roads of Texas, a route he often took to avoid the congested highways. It was a dark, stormy night, the kind where the rain falls in sheets and the wind howls like a banshee. The road was empty, and the only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the windshield wipers. As he drove, Sam saw something up ahead, a figure standing on the side of the road drenched in the pouring rain. As he got closer, he realized it was a young woman, her clothes soaked and her hair plastered to her face. She was holding out her thumb, hoping for a ride. Sam wasn't in the habit of picking up hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of the night, but something about the woman made him stop. Maybe it was the look of desperation in her eyes, or the thought of leaving her out in the storm. He pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" he called out. The woman nodded, her face pale and tired. She climbed into the truck without a word, her clothes dripping onto the floor. Sam offered her a towel, which she took gratefully, wrapping it around her shivering body. They drove in silence for a while, the sound of the rain hammering on the roof the only noise. Sam tried to make conversation, but the woman only gave short, quiet answers. She seemed distant, lost in her own thoughts. Sam asked her where she was headed, and she mumbled the name of a small town a few miles up the road. As they approached the town, the storm began to let up, the rain tapering off to a light drizzle. Sam glanced over at the woman, but she was staring straight ahead, her expression blank. He asked her if she had family in the town, but she didn't respond. They entered the town, the streets deserted and the houses dark. Sam followed the woman's directions, turning down a narrow, winding road that led to a small, old house on the outskirts of town. The house looked run down, with peeling paint and overgrown weeds in the yard. The woman suddenly spoke, her voice soft and distant. "Thank you for the ride," she said. "You can drop me off here." Sam pulled over, but before he could say anything, the woman was already out of the truck walking towards the house. She didn't look back, didn't say another word. Sam watched her until she disappeared into the shadows, then he pulled away feeling uneasy. Something about the whole encounter didn't sit right with him. He decided to stop at the local diner to grab a coffee and clear his head before continuing his journey. As he sat at the counter, he mentioned the hitchhiker to the waitress, describing the woman and the house she had gone to. The waitress's face went pale. She leaned in close, her voice a whisper. "You said you dropped her off at that old house on the edge of town?" Sam nodded, confused by her reaction. "That house has been abandoned for years," the waitress said. "The family that lived there was a girl who went missing a long time ago. Some say she died in a car accident on a night just like this, and her spirit still roams the roads, looking for a ride home." Sam felt a chill run down his spine. He hurried back to his truck and drove back to the house, hoping to find some explanation. But when he got there, the house was dark and empty, just as the waitress had said. There was no sign of the woman, and the front door was locked tight, covered in dust and cobwebs. He got back into his truck and sped away, the story of the vanishing hitchhiker now more than just a legend. Sam never forgot that night, and every time he drove those back roads, he couldn't shake the feeling that he might see her again, standing on the side of the road, waiting for a ride that would take her to a place beyond this world.